Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Or for you first timers, welcome to the channel for the first time. We're gonna be going into part 2 of our series on Ragnar Blackmane of the Space Wolves today. Here's what we're gonna be looking at mostly with this kit. How are we gonna do his gold and how are we gonna do the fur on his cape? Those are two big things that normally as we paint them with miniatures, they can be a struggle. A lot of times metallics and gold particularly, we kind of just have this formula of we lay down like a retributor gold and we throw a wash over top of it and we come back later with maybe a little bit lighter gold, maybe we put some silver highlights on it, but we don't do a whole lot with gold to make it interesting, to make it have color variation, to make it anything more than just kind of this bland, it's there. So we're gonna be looking at how to take our gold and make it just a little bit better. We're not going into non-metallic metals or anything like that. We're still keeping it true metallic metal, but how do we go maybe one step, two steps beyond kind of that basic formula for it? With the fur as well, a lot of times when it comes to painting fur, I find that people struggle with how to find that right medium of putting time into it and making it look good, but not going too far. We either go, well, I'm just gonna dry brush it and that'll catch all the edges, that'll catch all the ridges and it will look fine. But we come out with something that looks chalky, with something that has a texture that's dusty. We're not really looking for that kind of look. Or we go the opposite direction and we feel like we have to take every single piece and highlight it up individually and go over it, and it's painstaking and it's just an absolute headache. So the method we're gonna be looking at today is gonna be one that it's simple, it looks good, it's clean, and I think it gives a very interesting color and feel to the fur. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the painting and finish up Ragnar Blackmane. For the gold, I wanted something that was gonna be a little bit deeper, a little bit richer than just a regular gold, than just something that's pretty plain and bright. I wanted a lot more depth to it. So we're gonna mix a little bit of this copper in with our gold. It's about a 50-50 mix, maybe 60-40 towards the gold, but it's gonna give us a little bit more color variation. It's gonna give us a little bit more depth, which is what we want. Like always, this is gonna take us a couple layers to build up. We don't wanna do in one go, especially with metallics. They can be very streaky, they can be very gloopy, and they just kind of look very thick on a model. So we wanna make sure we thin them down and we put them on so that they're nice and smooth. And to get an opaque finish, a lot of times that's gonna require us to come over this a second time anyways. We're mixing a black with a deep red and then really watering it down into a wash consistency. And we're actually gonna apply this over every piece of gold. We're not just focusing on the recesses, we're focusing on covering all the gold, every bit of it, because we want this color shift to it. We want this dark, deep red to kind of change the tone of our metal as a whole, rather than just to shade it. Now we're gonna keep this shade on our palette because we're gonna come back to it and we're gonna use it at the final stage after we start brightening things up. We jump into a pure rich gold here and we're just gonna dry brush it over these wolf heads on the back because they're much larger surfaces away from the armor or anything else that we have to worry about getting gold flakes on. So we're able to dry brush these up just to make it a little bit faster to get into these next stages. Continuing with our rich gold, we're gonna build up the highlights on every piece of gold throughout this model. We're really going to cover a lot of what we've already covered with this rich gold. We don't want to cover everything, but we want to come back over and not just hit highlights, but we really want to hit those midtones because we're going to slowly build up into our brightest highlights. We're adding this Tenere yellow. It's a palish yellow. It's actually one of my favorite yellows out there. It's not very vibrant. It's a little bit more muted. And we're gonna add it straight into our rich gold. And the reason we're doing this is because when you paint with true metallic metal, that metal pigment, that metal flakes that are in that paint, basically decides where your highlights are gonna be. It decides how light is going to reflect. Well, that's why a lot of people do non-metallic metals, because they want to control the reflections. They want to control how the model is going to look and where the brightness is going to be. Now, we're not doing non-metallic metal, but we're going to take this Tenere yellow, we're going to add it to our gold because it helps us control a little bit of where that brightness and where that reflection will actually show through. Just like we would highlight anything else, we're just kind of shrinking the area and focusing on the higher ridges where that light would hit more as we move along. We're gonna make these areas smaller and smaller as we paint up to brighter and brighter highlights. We're going to continue to add more Tenere yellow into our rich gold and continue to shrink down these highlights and narrow the area that we want the light to be focusing on. Finally, we're gonna come back with a pure pale yellow, and we're just gonna hit the brightest edges and these corners, the places that we really want life to reflect. As you can see here, coming back over it a second time to build that up and basically really focus in on where we want the eye to be caught, where we want these reflections to actually shine through. If we paint too much area with this color, it's gonna make it look yellow, and we don't want yellow, we want gold. So make sure we use this only to control highlights rather than to make it look yellow. So we wanna make sure we control where we use this to only focus on the absolute brightest reflections. We're coming back over at the end with our wash that we've kept on our palette, and the reason being, as I've painted this up, there's parts that I felt got a little bit too bright. There's some areas that I wanted to increase the contrast and add even more depth into them, and this basically is just an easy way of controlling that, of coming back, knocking down a little bit of brightness, but also deepening some of those tones that were already there, but I just want to emphasize a little bit more. I want to create more contrast. For the steel here, we're going very simple like we have before in other videos. We're going to use our Vallejo metals, which I absolutely am in love with. Going to use our dark aluminum. Really, it only requires one coat, probably the only paint that requires a single coat on this entire model. And we're gonna go over and we're just gonna hit all of the steel parts. To shade these models, we've actually gone with Basilican Gray. And the reason I like this is that it gives the metal kind of a dull look to it. It doesn't make it dark. It doesn't really stain it a whole lot, but it just adds a kind of duller look to it than maybe your Nuln Oils or using a more of a black shade into the metal parts. We're gonna highlight this up with our silver color, once again a Vallejo metal color. Being very careful, I cannot say this enough, being very careful that we control our highlights here, because if we cover too much of the surface of this metal with our silver color, it just makes it look too bright, it just makes it look kind of fake. So we're gonna hit just the brightest highlights, as well as all the rivets on the chest plate and the backpack and wherever else we find them along his armor here. Once again, being very controlled in how we apply this. We just want to put a little bit on where that brightest reflection comes in. We're going to come in and bring back up these little rivets, these little dots here in between the blades themselves, and we want to make sure that we only hit very specific areas. All of the red on this model, whether it be the cloaks or it be the gems, we want to go from a really deep dark color up to a fairly bright red into kind of an orangey type of color. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with our deep red, and we're going to base coat everything. We're going to put it all on here, but instead of just jumping to the next color, as we build up, we're just going to add Antares Red into Aldebaran Red into this deep red and continue to build it up in extremely thin coats. For the red part of his cloak, one of the big things is it's a large, smooth surface. So in order to keep it from looking streaky, in order to keep it from having brush strokes show up or looking chalky or anything like that, we're gonna make sure that we really do work with thin coats and we slowly build them up. It's gonna take about 2 coats just to really get an opaque deep red finish on the cloak. But then even after that, as we add in the Antares Red, as we add in the Aldebaran Red into our deep red mix, we're gonna slowly and with a very watered down consistency add it on there so that that color becomes a very subtle shift. You can see here that as we build up those brighter highlights, shrinking down the areas in which we're going to paint them on, especially when it comes to the gems on his belt and on his little medallion there that's holding the clasp of his cape. We want to shrink that down so that it gives the idea of it being brighter. As we're going to get to the final stages, we'll add some bright edge highlights onto the very edges of those gems to make them seem as if they're reflective. As I've done with most everything on this model, I have a black wash that I've just kept on my palette. I've just kept at all times as I'm painting this red. So whenever I feel like it's getting a little bit too bright, or I feel like those shadow tones need to go a little bit deeper, we can simply use that to accomplish those things rather than having to come back later at a different time and try to fix it up then. But like with everything with this paint job, it's just been very fluid, and it requires going back and forth and back and forth, and getting it where I want it to be takes quite a bit of time, and there isn't necessarily a specific formula to doing it. It's just you've got to do it and work on it and get it to where you're happy with it. As a final edge highlight onto the gems and the cloak, I've added some sunny skin tone into our final mix that has a considerable amount of Antares Red and Aldebaran Red mixed into it at this point. And I just come across and I hit those edges, and I hit where there's rips in the cloak. I hit the edges on those just to make them stand out and make them more visible, and actually really show off kind of the wear and tear that's in this cloak as a whole, but also with the gems along all the edges in order to make them look reflective. Coming back over with some pure white just to kind of hit some of those highest parts on the gems to give them that glint, make them appear as if they're different than the red cloak or the red around the belt. And then also coming back in with my shade, as you can see, and reintegrating some of the shadows into the area, making sure they're as deep as I want to go on the cloak, doing that as well. Once again, it's this constant back and forth getting it to where I want to go, rather than just a linear take this step and take that step. It's going back and forth between the steps until I'm happy with the result. For the leather, I wanted to keep it homogeneous with the rest of the army, so we're going to use this mahogany color that we used with our other Space Marines in the painting a Space Marine Vanguard box that we did as Space Wolves as well. It's this deep, rich color. I really like it. I really like pro Acryl colors in general, but this brown especially just has a lot of character to it. A lot like the cloak. We're gonna start with our mahogany brown, and then we're gonna come into our brown leather by scale 75, and we're gonna come back and roughly cover probably 80 to 85% of what we've already covered in. And we're gonna do this in two separate layers and shrinking it down to maybe 70%, 65% on the second go around. We then build up into our walnut, and this is just pure walnut. We're not mixing these in. We're going straight from one color to the next. We're being very scratchy and basically coming over, we're shrinking down our highlighting area, really focusing on edges. And when painting leather, really focus on creases, focus on places where the leather would be bending, the leather would be moving, because that's where it would crack the most. And finally, we're gonna come back with our Thar brown, and we're gonna use this as very much an edge highlight just to kind of pick out some parts. Not everything, we're not gonna hit every edge here. We just wanna focus on some of them in order to bring that brightness up and in order to give it that very realistic leathery look. Finally, we're coming back with a sepia wash, and I find that this really just makes it look like leather. We're gonna come back and we're gonna wash the entirety of it. Now you wanna make sure that with this, I'm using a sepia ink, you wanna make sure it's pretty watered down, it's not extremely strong. We just want it to kind of tint and give that oily look to the leather. For the fur, it's a pretty simple concept. We start with our Arabic shadow and we're gonna water this down, not to a glaze, not to a wash consistency, but we're gonna water it down more than we normally would, which means it's probably gonna require a second coat to come over it with, but we're gonna cover pretty much the entirety of all of this fur with this color. If you want to see a better example of this, I believe this is a technique that I saw Angel Heraldes use. It might have been when he was painting his Gothmog from Lord of the Rings, the Battle for Middle-earth strategy game. So we come back over with our chocolate brown, once again, the exact same consistency, but what we're doing here is we're shrinking the area. We're focusing more towards the middle of the fur and we're just leaving those edges with that Arabic shadow still showing through. Once again, it may require a second coat to get it as opaque as you may want it to be. You may just use that second coat to focus on the middle parts, and that way it kind of eases in the transition from the edges being Arabic shadow into this middle part being chocolate brown. Coming back, exact same thing, but once again, we shrink down where we're going. Put the black right down the center of the fur, really focus on that middle section, and with this one, because it's black, you may not need to go over it a second time. It may be fine just the way that it is, and especially because this will be your final color, so you want that transition between the other two colors into your black to look smooth, so be careful if you're coming back a second time that you don't make that jump too startling. With our next two colors, we're coming back and we're just gonna highlight up the fur. We're gonna give it a little bit more variation. We're focusing a lot on the edges and brightening those up, but we also wanna pick out just pieces in the fur, nothing particular, just different areas where we wanna pick it out in the black and the chocolate brown. And then we're also gonna use this color in order to paint up the face and in order to paint up the paws as well. Exact same thing with this color, but once again, we're gonna shrink down the area in which we're doing it. We're gonna focus our highlights. We really want it to be on the edges of this fur. This will be on the very brightest outside, and then some of the other pieces that are in parts of the darker fur. And we're also going to use this to highlight up our skin the rest of the way. For the claws, we're painting them all in black, and then I'm actually going to come back over with the deep red that we used on the cloak just to hit the edges of the claws to give them a little bit of color variation to keep them from looking super flat and just give them a nice look. So here's the finished look. I hope you have enjoyed this video and I hope you enjoyed the first one as well. They were definitely a lot of fun to do and great to see my favorite character finally finished. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that there's a little bit in there that was helpful for you, maybe a technique that you can kind of grab and use, maybe something you already knew that was a good reminder, maybe just a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of entertainment, a little bit of fun. Hopefully you can take it and you can use it in your own painting. I appreciate you guys so much. I appreciate all the support that you guys have given to the channel. Go and watch some of our other videos. If you haven't, would love to hear your feedback and comment. You can jump on our Instagram. You can message me directly off of there if you want to talk. I'd love to talk with you painting on there. I appreciate it if you guys would give us a like, if you guys would subscribe to the channel. That would be absolutely awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you guys have a great day. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.